My name is Julia, and I am 33 years old. After my grandfather Harrison's funeral, I did not tell my parents that he had left me $15 million. I am glad I kept it a secret, because a week later what he revealed about their past shocked me to the core. I work as a forensic accountant. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. 45 minutes after my grandfather's funeral reception ended, the oak door swung open. I was standing at the sink washing the crystal glasses we used to toast his memory. The annex had been my home for 3 years. I restored the space, painting the walls a warm cream color so I could live close by and care for him during his final decline. My mother, Carolyn, walked in wearing an impeccable black dress, her expression devoid of grief. My father, Richard, trailed behind her, checking his watch with mild irritation. Neither offered a comforting hug or a word of solace about the man we just buried. Instead, my mother approached the center of the kitchen carrying a stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes. With a calculated motion, she tossed the stack onto the granite island. She grabbed the top box and slid it aggressively across the stone surface. The harsh scraping sound cut through the quiet morning of the house. The box stopped inches from my hands. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands, waiting for an explanation I already knew would break my heart. "You have until midnight to vacate the premises," my mother said. Her voice was steady and clinical. "We have contacted a liquidation firm. They will be here tomorrow morning to stage the property for an immediate cash sale." I stared at her, trying to process the cruelty of her timing. Grandpa Harrison had not been in the ground for a full day. I paused my life to ensure he had round-the-clock care when she and my father claimed they were too busy with their wealth management firm to help. "You are selling the annex tomorrow?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the shock. Where exactly am I supposed to go at midnight with 3 years of my life packed into boxes? "That is a logistical issue you will need to solve on your own," my father interjected, crossing his arms. "We do not have the luxury of giving you a transition period. Your brother needs capital by the end of the week." Of course, it was always about Spencer. My older brother was 36 and the undisputed golden child. While I quietly built a solid independent career examining corporate fraud, Spencer lived loud and large as the founder of a venture-backed tech logistics startup. My parents treated him like a visionary, funding his lavish lifestyle and bailing out his continuous missteps. "Spencer just received massive seed money last quarter," I pointed out. "Why does he need the money from my home?" "It is not your home, Julia," my mother corrected sharply. "It is a family asset, and the family requires liquidity. Spencer is hemorrhaging money. He has a major merger pending, and his creditors are threatening to pull out if he does not show immediate personal capital." I looked between them, recognizing the familiar wall of parental solidarity that only existed to protect my brother. "You are kicking me out onto the street on the day of your own father's funeral to cover Spencer's business debts." My mother's eyes narrowed, offended that I stated the raw truth. She smoothed her dress and lifted her chin. "Spencer is 1/4 away from a tech journal feature, Julia. You audit spreadsheets for mid-tier suppliers. Family assets must protect the legacy earner. Pack your things." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the room. I knew exactly who these people were. They viewed my forensic accounting career as a tedious desk job, completely ignoring the fact that my skills were highly specialized and lucrative. They only ever saw true value in Spencer's flashy presentations and empty promises. I did not raise my voice. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I simply looked at the flattened boxes on the granite island, then looked back at my parents. "You want me out by midnight?" I confirmed quietly. "We expect the space to be completely empty," my father added, checking his watch again. "Do not leave any of your cheap furniture behind. The staging company has their own modern pieces coming in. We need this place to look appealing to high-end buyers." The disrespect was deliberate, designed to put me in my place. For my entire life, I had been the reliable background character. I was the daughter they called when they needed someone to handle the unglamorous tasks, like managing Grandpa Harrison's hospice care. But when it came to sharing the rewards or offering basic familial respect, I was entirely invisible. I did not argue. I walked back to my bedroom and pulled my dark canvas suitcases from my closet, setting them onto the hardwood floor. The small room was completely quiet as I opened the main compartment. I did not cry, because tears simply would not change the reality of my situation. I moved to my dresser, opening the top drawer with practiced efficiency. My movements were methodical and precise, mirroring the very skills I used every day as a forensic accountant. I sorted through my clothes, folding each item with a steady hand. My mind processed the events with cold clarity. My grandfather Harrison had been the only person in this family who ever saw me as more than just a background character. I spent the last 3 years living in this annex, ensuring he was comfortable during his final decline, while my parents claimed their schedules were simply too demanding. I had personally sanded these hardwood floors. I had painted these walls a warm cream color because he said it reminded him of the morning sun. Now I was boxing up my life in the very space we had shared so many quiet conversations. I moved from the dresser to the bookshelf, carefully taking down the heavy accounting texts and the few framed photographs I possessed. I wrapped each frame in a sweater, placing them at the center of my suitcase. There was no hysteria in my actions. Panic would only validate my parents' twisted narrative that I was weak and incapable. I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. I stacked my boxes by the door, creating a neat tower of my existence. As I was taping the final box shut, the heavy oak front door of the annex swung open. There was no knock, no polite announcement of arrival. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed down the short hallway. It was my older brother Spencer. I stood up, wiping dust from my dark trousers, and walked into the living room. Spencer was pacing across the floor I had just vacuumed that morning, his expensive Italian leather shoes tracking in faint traces of dirt from the driveway. He held his phone a few inches from his face, speaking loudly on speakerphone. He wore a custom-tailored navy suit, looking perfectly groomed and completely unaffected by the fact that we had just buried our grandfather a few hours ago. He did not even look in my direction. He ended his call and retrieved a digital laser measuring tape from his jacket pocket. Without a word of condolence, he pointed the red laser across the living room, aiming it directly above my gray sofa. The device beeped cheerfully in the quiet room. He jotted down a number on a small notepad he had brought with him. I stood near the hallway, watching him literally measure the space for staging furniture, while my packed boxes sat just a few feet away. His absolute arrogance filled the room, suffocating any lingering trace of grief or respect. Spencer moved toward the kitchen island, aiming the laser at the ceiling to calculate the drop for a light fixture. He was erasing me from the property before I even crossed the threshold. This was the golden child, in his natural element, entirely consumed by his own needs and completely blind to anyone else. Anyone. "Are you going to be much longer?" he asked suddenly, not looking up from his notepad. "The staging team is arriving tomorrow morning and they need a completely blank canvas. They cannot be tripping over your thrift store belongings." I picked up my purse and said I will be gone before midnight, Spencer, just as Mother requested. I kept my voice perfectly level, projecting a chilling calmness. He finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of annoyance and superiority. "Look, Julia, do not try to make me the villain here. You have to look at the bigger picture. My tech logistics startup is 1/4 away from a major feature in a national business journal. I am dealing with high-level venture capitalists and massive supply chain mergers. You audit spreadsheets for mid-tier vendors. You have to understand that family assets must be allocated to protect the legacy earner." The sheer hypocrisy of his statement was almost laughable. He was hemorrhaging money, running his company into the ground with reckless spending and empty promises, while I ran a highly profitable independent consulting firm that they simply chose to ignore. But I did not argue. Arguing required emotional investment, and I had completely divested from this family. "I understand exactly what is happening, Spencer," I replied, my tone completely flat. "You need capital to cover your massive margins, and selling the annex is your emergency parachute. He bristled, his jaw tightening at my accurate assessment. "Just make sure you do not leave any trash behind," he snapped, turning his back to me and pointing his laser measure toward the hallway. "We need this place pristine for the high-end buyers." I did not respond. I simply turned and walked back to my bedroom to retrieve my final suitcase. I rolled my luggage down the hallway, the wheels clicking softly against the hardwood. I carried my boxes out to my modest dark sedan parking in the driveway. The cool night air hit my face, bringing a sharp clarity to my senses. I loaded the trunk, arranging everything with the same forensic precision I applied to my work. I closed the trunk with a solid thud and walked back inside the annex for the last time. The living room felt empty now, stripped of my presence. I walked over to the granite kitchen island. This was the exact spot where my mother had aggressively slid the flattened cardboard box toward me hours earlier. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my silver house key. I placed it gently on the cool stone surface. I did not leave a note. There was nothing left to say to people who only valued me as an unpaid caretaker and a convenient scapegoat. I walked out the front door, closing it firmly behind me. I heard the lock click securely into place, sealing away my past. I finally got into my car and started the engine. I pulled out of the long, winding driveway of the estate, watching the towering trees and heavy iron gates fade into the darkness of my rearview mirror. I merged slowly onto the quiet highway, heading toward the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance. The rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt was the only sound in the car. I felt an unexpected wave of profound peace settling over me. The worst had happened, and I had survived it with my dignity entirely intact. Just as I reached the city limits, my car speakers chimed loudly. My phone was ringing through the Bluetooth system. I glanced at the dashboard screen. The caller identification displayed the name of Mr. Kensington Grandpa Harrison's notoriously ruthless estate attorney. It was nearly midnight, an incredibly unusual time for a prominent lawyer to be making calls. I tapped the screen to answer, keeping my eyes on the empty road ahead. "Ms. Julia." His voice came through the speakers, crisp and professional, devoid of any small talk or pleasantries. "Your parents are currently operating under the assumption that the estate is drained. Please come to my office tomorrow at 8 in the morning. Your grandfather left highly specific confidential instructions exclusively for you." I pulled into a downtown Chicago parking garage just before 8 o'clock the next morning. The drive from the roadside motel had been a blur of highway lines and exhaustion. I had slept for maybe 3 hours, my mind spinning relentlessly with the weight of Mr. Kensington's cryptic phone call. Walking into the marble lobby of the high-rise, I felt entirely out of place. My slacks were wrinkled from packing in a hurry, and my flat shoes squeaked against the stone floor. I rode the elevator up to the 42nd floor, mentally preparing myself. Grandpa Harrison had always been a practical man. I assumed he had left me a vintage pocket watch or a modest savings bond to cover my consulting firm's overhead for a month. I expected a brief sentimental meeting, resulting in a tiny piece of closure. When the law firm doors opened, a receptionist guided me down a hallway lined with abstract art. Mr. Kensington was waiting beside the window in his corner office. The room smelled of rich leather and lemon polish. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city looked like a miniature model detached from the messy reality of my eviction the night before. Mr. Kensington turned around and gestured for the receptionist to leave. He was a man in his late 60s with sharp gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He wore a charcoal suit and projected absolute authority. He did not offer generic condolences or pitying looks. Instead, he walked past me, grasped the brass handle of his office door, and locked it. The click echoed sharply in the quiet room, sending a spike of adrenaline through my chest. The physical action instantly elevated the tension in the air. He gestured for me to sit in a leather chair directly opposite his desk. I sat down, clutching my purse tightly in my lap. He moved back to his chair and reached into a locked bottom drawer. He pulled out a thick financial portfolio bound in dark leather. With a firm push, he slid it across the mahogany surface. It stopped right in front of me, heavy and imposing. I stared at the embossed lettering on the cover, my heart beating faster. "Open it, Julia," he instructed quietly, leaning back in his chair. I unfastened the brass clasp and flipped open the heavy cover. The first page was a summary sheet printed on thick linen paper. At first, the numbers blurred together. My exhausted eyes tried to make sense of the columns and the rows of data. I am a trained forensic accountant. I look at financial statements every single day, tracking hidden assets and exposing fraud for my clients. But looking at this specific document completely paralyzed my analytical brain. It did not make sense based on what my family had been screaming about for the past year. Before you process the figures, Mr. Kensington said, resting his elbows on the desk, you need to understand your grandfather's strategy. 3 years ago, when his health began to decline, he came to me with a specific problem. He knew his daughter and son-in-law were circling like vultures. He knew Spencer was bleeding capital from his startup, and that Carolyn and Richard would stop at nothing to bail him out. Harrison wanted to know exactly who truly cared for him and who merely saw him as a stepping stone to their next luxury purchase. I looked up from the portfolio, my breath catching in my throat. The depleted accounts, I whispered, remembering how my parents had complained about the exorbitant cost of his hospice care, claiming his money had dried up. They told everyone he made terrible investments. Exactly. Kensington nodded, a satisfied smile touching his lips. He intentionally restructured his public-facing assets. He moved his liquid capital, his prime commercial real estate holdings, and his aggressive investments into buried anonymous corporate structures. He orchestrated a brilliant illusion. He made it look as though bad market bets and compounding medical expenses had left him with almost nothing. It was a test, Julia. A calculated test of character designed to reveal the true nature of Carolyn and Richard's greed. And they failed, I said, the memory of my mother shoving the flattened cardboard boxes at me flashing vividly in my mind. They failed spectacularly. Kensington agreed, his tone turning cold. The moment they believed the money was gone, they stopped visiting. They stopped calling. They outsourced his care entirely to you, viewing him as a financial liability. They treated a brilliant man like an inconvenient burden. But you stayed, Julia. You painted those walls. You sat by his bed. You gave up your apartment to move into the annex and ensure he never spent a single night feeling alone. He saw everything. He measured every action, and he rewarded loyalty with absolute protection. I looked back down at the thick linen paper resting inside the portfolio. My eyes finally stabilized, locking onto the bottom line of the consolidated asset report. The number printed there was so massive it felt surreal. $15,200,000. I blinked, tracing the zeros with my index finger, half expecting the ink to vanish like a cruel mirage. It was a fully diversified, airtight blind trust. Flipping through the pages, I saw exactly how he had protected it. The trust contained high-yield municipal bonds, blue-chip stocks, and prime commercial real estate holdings, generating quarterly dividends. The sheer scale of the wealth sat heavy beneath my hands. "This is all exclusively in your name," Mr. Kensington said softly, allowing the reality of the situation to wash over me. "Your grandfather transferred every meaningful asset he possessed into this trust. You are the sole beneficiary. Your parents have absolutely no access. Spencer has no access. The trust is completely immune to any standard probate challenge because it was established long before his death and deliberately hidden behind ironclad legal firewalls. He wanted to make sure they could never touch a single cent." I sat back in the leather chair, the air leaving my lungs in a long, shaky exhale. 24 hours ago, I was packing my life into cardboard boxes, humiliated, discarded, and evicted by the very people who were supposed to love and protect me. I had driven away in a cheap sedan in the middle of the night, believing I had nothing left but my own stubborn independence and a moderately successful consulting firm. Now, sitting in this quiet, expensive office overlooking the city, the entire power dynamic of my family had violently shifted. I was no longer the forgotten background character. I was no longer the reliable, silent scapegoat meant to absorb my brother's endless failures. This portfolio was not just a collection of liquid cash. It was the ultimate secret weapon. It was an impenetrable financial fortress that armed me with God, like leverage over the people who had just thrown me out into the street to save their golden child. The quiet power of $15 million vibrated through the room, humming with the promise of absolute control. I closed the portfolio, letting my hand rest flat against the dark, cool leather cover. My overwhelming grief over losing the only man who ever truly loved me began to harden into something entirely different. It transformed into a cold, calculated clarity, a sharp realization that I now held the key to my own liberation and their inevitable destruction. Mr. Kensington leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto mine. Before you start making plans for that money, Julia, you must listen to me very carefully, he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. You cannot touch a single dime of this trust right now. You cannot let your parents or your brother know that this money exists. I looked at him slightly confused. It is a blind trust, and you said it is ironclad. If it is legally mine, why do I need to hide it? Because your parents are desperate, Kensington replied, and desperate people with aggressive corporate lawyers are incredibly dangerous. If Carolyn and Richard discover that you have $15 million in liquid assets, they will immediately file an injunction to freeze the trust. They will tie you up in frivolous litigation for years. I shook my head. On what grounds? Grandpa Harrison passed psychological evaluations. He was entirely lucid. They will claim he was not of sound mind, Kensington stated bluntly. They will argue his decision to disinherit his daughter and primary male heir was the result of dementia. They will drag medical experts into court to testify that his illness clouded his judgment. They do not actually need to win the case, Julia. They only need to tie the money up in probate and bleed you dry with legal fees. They know you do not have the personal capital to fight a protracted legal battle. They will starve you out until you settle to save Spencer. The reality of his warning settled over me. He was absolutely right. My parents had an entire legal department at their disposal. They would drag Grandpa Harrison's name through the mud, painting him as a senile old man just to get their hands on his money. So I have to play poor, I said. I have to let them think they won. You have to be invisible, Kensington corrected. You go back to your life. You continue running your consulting firm. You rent an apartment. You do not offer them a single red cent when they inevitably come asking for more. You let them operate under the delusion that they successfully drained the estate and kicked you to the curb. You wait until they have backed themselves into a tight corner. I looked down at the dark leather portfolio. Revealing it now would only start a war I was not prepared to fight. I needed to let my parents and Spencer exhaust their own resources. I needed to let their greed blind them to the trap Grandpa Harrison had laid. I understand, I told the attorney. I will not say a word. I will let them believe I am just another casualty of their ambition. While I sat in that quiet office securing my future, a very different scene was unfolding 30 miles away in my parents' suburban mansion. I would later piece together the exact details of this morning from the digital trails I audited, but the reality of their panic was undeniable. Spencer was pacing the length of the Persian rug, his phone pressed so hard against his ear that his knuckles were white. He was sweating, his suit jacket discarded on a velvet armchair. "What do you mean you are issuing a margin call?" Spencer yelled into the receiver, his voice cracking. "We had an agreement. You promised me a 90-day grace period before calling in the loan." The voice on the other end of the line was entirely unsympathetic. Projections are meaningless when your supply chain partners are halting deliveries due to non-payment, Spencer. The grace period was contingent on you securing secondary bridge funding. You missed the deadline this morning. We are calling the debt. We need $3 million transferred into the holding account by Friday, or we are seizing and liquidating the startup immediately. Spencer stopped pacing, his face draining of color. "Friday? That is impossible. I just need a little more time. I have a merger pending." "You have until Friday," the investor replied coldly. "Do not make us send the liquidation team." The line went dead. Spencer stared at his phone, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the collapse of his corporate illusion. He turned around to find my mother and father standing in the doorway. Carolyn was holding a cup of coffee. her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly as she took in her golden child's state of distress. "Spencer, darling." "What is wrong?" she asked, rushing forward. "Was that the venture capital firm on the phone?" "They called the margin," Spencer said, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "They want $3 million by Friday, or they are seizing the company. The entire tech journal feature is going to be canceled. I am going to lose absolutely everything." Richard stepped into the room, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He had spent his entire career managing wealth, but his blind spot had always been his son. "Calm down," my father instructed, though his own voice betrayed a rising panic. "We can fix this. We just need to leverage our available liquidity. We will expedite the annex sale right now." "The annex is a tear-down property." Dad Spencer snapped, his frustration boiling over. "Even if we sell it to a cash buyer today, it is only going to net maybe $400,000 after taxes. That is a total drop in the bucket. I need $3 million." Carolyn looked at Richard, her eyes wide with mounting desperation. "Richard, what about the firm's reserve accounts? Can we borrow against the wealth management firm's equity? Just a short-term bridge loan until Spencer secures his next round of funding." "We cannot touch the firm's reserves," Richard replied, running a hand over his graying hair. "We are already over-leveraged from the last time we bailed him out. If I pull $3 million out of the corporate accounts right now, the regulatory board will trigger an immediate audit. We would lose our operating licenses." The pressure cooker environment of the mansion began to simmer. For years, they had operated under the assumption that Grandpa Harrison's vast fortune would eventually fall into their laps, providing a permanent safety net for Spencer's reckless spending. Now, staring at a massive financial deficit, the cold reality of their situation truly set in. Spencer sank onto the velvet armchair, burying his face in his hands. "It is over. I am going to be the laughingstock of the industry." "We will find the money," Carolyn insisted, her maternal instinct fiercely protective of her son, even as he dragged them toward bankruptcy. "We always find the money," from where Spencer demanded, looking up with bloodshot eyes. "We have tapped out the firm. The annex sale is useless. Grandpa Harrison's accounts are completely empty." Richard began pacing the rug, his mind racing through every possible avenue of financial extraction. His eyes narrowed as a predatory thought began to form. He stopped pacing and looked at Carolyn, a dark, calculating expression crossing his face. The estate was drained and the firm was over-leveraged, but there was one person left who had not been entirely squeezed dry. One person whose flawless credit score and highly lucrative consulting income could easily secure a commercial bridge loan. "Your sister," Richard said slowly, the words hanging heavily in the quiet room. While Richard was miles away formulating a plan to drag me into his financial sinkhole, I was still sitting across from Mr. Kensington in his downtown office. The reality of the $15 million trust was settling over me like a heavy protective blanket. I had spent my entire life as a secondary citizen in my own family, a tool to be utilized and discarded whenever Spencer required a safety net. Now I held the singular key to an empire my parents desperately craved, but could never touch. Mr. Kensington watched me process this paradigm shift. He did not rush me. He allowed the silence in the room to stretch, giving me time to absorb the absolute finality of my grandfather's design. Grandpa Harrison had not just left me money. He had left me an impenetrable fortress. "Are there any stipulations on the trust?" I asked, finally breaking the quiet atmosphere of the room. "Do I need to meet any specific conditions to maintain control of the assets?" "None," Mr. Kensington replied smoothly, closing the leather portfolio and resting his hands on top of it. "The trust is completely unconditional. Your grandfather trusted your judgment entirely. He knew you would not squander the capital the way your brother inevitably would. He simply wanted you to be protected. However, there is one final piece of business we need to address this morning." I watched as the attorney pushed his chair back from the desk and turned toward a small vintage safe tucked into the corner of his office. He spun the brass dial with practiced precision. The heavy metal door clicked open. He reached inside and withdrew something small. When he turned around and placed the item on the mahogany desk, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. It was an envelope crafted from thick, matte black paper. It looked heavy and remarkably formal. The flap was secured shut with a deep red wax seal bearing the distinct crest of my grandfather's original logistics company. The wax was thick and perfectly intact, ensuring the contents remained absolutely secure. The envelope looked out of place in a modern law firm. It looked like a relic from another era, a physical manifestation of a dark and looming mystery. Mr. Kensington did not slide the envelope across the desk the way he had done with the financial portfolio. He kept his hand resting lightly near it, his expression turning incredibly serious. "Your grandfather was a brilliant strategist, Julia," Mr. Kensington said, his voice dropping to a low, hushed tone. "He understood human nature better than anyone I have ever met in my legal career. He knew exactly what your parents and your brother were capable of doing when backed into a financial corner. He anticipated their desperation. And because he anticipated their desperation, he left you a specific set of instructions regarding this envelope." "What kind of instructions?" I asked, my eyes fixed on the dark red wax seal. "This envelope contains information of a highly sensitive and potentially devastating nature," Mr. Kensington explained carefully. "Your grandfather mandated that I keep it in my safe until the day you learned about the trust. But he was explicitly clear about when you are allowed to open it. You are not to open this envelope today. You are not to open it tomorrow. You are to keep it hidden and secure." "Then when do I open it?" I pressed, feeling a rising sense of apprehension. Mr. Kensington leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto mine with piercing intensity. "Your grandfather mandated that you only open this envelope when they inevitably attempt to destroy your career to save your brothers." The words hung in the air, chilling and absolute. Not if they attempt to destroy my career. When? Grandpa Harrison knew my parents so well that he viewed their future betrayal as an absolute certainty. He knew that when the rushed sale of the annex failed to cover Spencer's corporate debts, they would turn their sights on me. He knew they would not just ask for a loan, he knew they would demand it. And when I refused, he knew they would try to break me professionally, forcing me into financial submission, so I would have no choice but to bail out their golden child. "He really believed they would go that far," I whispered, my throat feeling incredibly dry. "He believed they would intentionally sabotage my livelihood." "He knew exactly who he raised, Julia," Mr. Kensington said softly. "He loved your mother, but he was not blind to her greed or her blind devotion to Spencer. He knew that Richard would utilize every ruthless tactic in his playbook to maintain their social standing and protect the firm. Your grandfather wanted you to be armed and ready for the moment they crossed the final line. This envelope is your response to that crossing." I reached out and picked up the black envelope. It was heavier than I expected, the thick paper rough beneath my fingertips. The wax seal felt cool and smooth. This was not a gift. It was a loaded weapon waiting to be fired. I carefully opened my leather purse and slipped the envelope inside, placing it into a zippered compartment for safekeeping. "You must remember the strategy we discussed," Mr. Kensington continued, his tone shifting back to professional advisory. "You are armed with immense financial power, but that power only works if it remains entirely hidden. You must go back to your daily life. You must project the image of a struggling independent consultant who was just evicted from her home. You must let them underestimate you. You must let them believe they hold all the cards." "I will play the long game," I assured him, zipping my purse closed. "I will not give them a single reason to suspect that anything has changed." "Good," Mr. Kensington said, offering a tight, approving nod. "Because when they come for you, and they will come for you, you need to be positioned perfectly. Let them show their true colors. Let them initiate the conflict. And when they finally attempt to strike your career, you will know exactly what to do." I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing my trousers. The anxiety and exhaustion that plagued me since the funeral were completely gone. I thanked the attorney for his time and guidance. He unlocked his office door, and I walked out into the bright hallway, leaving the quiet sanctuary of the law firm behind me. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, my mind racing with possibilities. The transition from victim to architect was swift and empowering. I stepped through the revolving glass doors and out onto the busy downtown Chicago street. The morning sun was bright, reflecting off the glass facades of the surrounding skyscrapers. The city noise washed over me, a chaotic symphony of traffic and rushing pedestrians. I walked toward the parking garage, clutching my purse tightly against me. Inside that bag, I carried the proof of a $15 million fortune and a heavily sealed black envelope that held the power to upend my family history. I was stepping onto the battlefield fully equipped and entirely invisible. They had discarded me like trash, but they had absolutely no idea that I now owned the entire garbage dump. I smiled as I reached my car, ready to face whatever predatory demands my father was cooking up in his suburban mansion. While my father was calculating how to leverage my existence to save his son, I was systematically building my new reality. Within 48 hours of leaving the office, I signed a lease on an apartment in an upscale high-rise in Chicago. The building featured biometric elevator access and a private underground garage. I paid the exorbitant first and last month's rent, using the operational accounts from my independent consulting firm. My parents had spent years dismissing my business, completely ignoring the highly lucrative income I pulled in. They had no idea I could easily afford premium real estate without ever touching a single cent of Grandpa Harrison's $15 million trust. Following Mr. Kensington's explicit instructions, I kept my lifestyle visibly modest. I furnished the apartment with understated pieces. I bought a beige sofa, a practical glass dining table, and unassuming rugs. To the untrained eye, my apartment looked like the dwelling of a struggling professional trying to scrape by. The real luxury was the absolute silence provided by the thick, soundproofed walls. I spent my days working from my home office, aggressively expanding my client roster, and waiting. I knew they would come. The answer arrived exactly 12 days after my eviction from the annex. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen island reviewing a quarterly tax projection for a client when the intercom on my wall chimed. Ms. Julia, the concierge, said, his tone carrying a hint of tension. I apologize for the interruption, but there is a Mr. and Mrs. Wilson here in the lobby. They do not have an appointment, but they are insisting on coming up to your residence. My heart performed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. Richard had undoubtedly hired a private investigator to track down my new address. A normal person might have panicked or instructed security to turn them away, but I remembered the specific strategy. I had to let them show their hand. Send them up, I replied, my voice remarkably steady. I closed my laptop and moved into the living room. I did not bother checking my appearance. I was wearing faded jeans and a plain gray sweater. A few minutes later, a heavy knock echoed from my front door. I walked over, disengaged the deadbolt, and pulled the heavy door open. Richard and Carolyn stood waiting in the hallway. My father wore a tailored suit, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. My mother wore her signature cashmere coat, her eyes immediately darting past me to assess my living space. They stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Well, my mother said, her voice dripping with condescension as she looked at my plain beige sofa. I suppose this is what you could afford on such short notice. It is very sparse, Julia. Are you sure it is safe here? The building has biometric security, Mom, I said, flatly, crossing my arms over my chest. How did you find me? Your father has his ways, she replied dismissively. We did not come here to discuss logistics. We came because we are a family, and families must stick together during difficult times. My father set his briefcase down on my glass dining table with a very solid thud. He popped the latches, the metallic click slicing through the quiet room. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents marked with red advisory flags, skipping pleasantries or apologies for my eviction entirely. We are facing a slight cash flow issue, Richard stated, his tone now aggressively casual. Spencer has a massive opportunity to expand his logistics company, but his venture capitalists are demanding a temporary show of liquidity. We need to secure a commercial bridge loan for $500,000. I stared at him, my expression completely blank. You want $500,000? It is just a formality, my father insisted, tapping the top of the thick paperwork. The estate is currently tied up and my firm's capital is restricted due to regulatory audits. We need a clean credit profile to secure the bridge loan. You have zero corporate debt and a spotless credit history. We simply need you to co-sign the loan. The money will be repaid in exactly 30 days. You will not pay a single dime. The sheer audacity of the demand was suffocating. They had assumed I was financially desperate, and now they were tracking me down to demand I risk my own financial ruin to bail out Spencer. It was a classic dangerous predatory loan with astronomical interest rates and hidden penalties designed to trap desperate borrowers. If I signed those papers, I would be legally responsible for $500,000 when Spencer inevitably defaulted. They expected me to simply roll over and accept the liability, just as I had always blindly accepted their neglect. I looked at the thick stack of documents, then up at my father's expectant face. "No," I said. The single quiet syllable hung in the air, sharp, heavy, and absolute. Richard blinked several times, his brow furrowing as if he had misheard me. He was clearly not expecting immediate resistance. "What do you mean, no? I just explained the entire situation to you. It is a short-term 30-day bridge loan. You are merely guaranteeing all the terms." "I am a forensic accountant, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously level. "I know exactly what a predatory bridge loan looks like. Spencer is hemorrhaging money. His company is failing on a spectacular level. If I co-sign that new loan, the bank will come directly after me the absolute second he defaults. I am not leveraging my flawless financial standing or my business to cover my brother's catastrophic failures. The answer is absolutely no." The polite, calculating facade shattered instantly. My mother's face flushed a deep, mottled red, her features twisting with pure, unfiltered outrage. "How dare you?" she practically spat, stepping aggressively toward me. "After everything this family has done for you, we allowed you to live in the estate annex, rent-free for 3 solid years, while you played around blindly with your consulting business. I lived there to take care of Grandpa Harrison because you explicitly refused to do it," I countered, refusing to back down now. "You threw me out into the street the very day we buried him. And now you show up here unannounced, demanding I take on $500,000 of toxic debt to save Spencer. You are completely delusional." Richard slammed his open hand down on the glass dining table, making the heavy stack of documents jump. "You ungrateful little brat!" he roared, his face contorting with an explosive rage. "Your brother is on the verge of securing a national legacy. He is the future of this family. You run a pathetic little bookkeeping hobby that nobody here cares about. You owe us this signature. You are destroying the family name out of pure spite and jealousy." "I am protecting myself," I stated, staring directly into his furious, calculating eyes. "I will not sign it. Take all your predatory paperwork and get out of my apartment right now." "You are a traitor to your own flesh and blood," my mother screamed, her voice echoing harshly off the high, pristine ceilings of the living room. "You are dead to us, Julia. Do you hear me? You are nothing but a bitter, selfish failure." I stood completely still as the heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind them. The silence of my apartment returned instantly, rushing in to fill the toxic vacuum my parents had left behind. My hands were shaking slightly, but I did not feel the crushing weight of guilt they wanted me to carry. I felt liberated. I walked over to the security panel, reset the deadbolt, and programmed the system to ignore any future access requests from Richard or Carolyn Wilson. They were locked out of my home, and for the first time in my life, locked out of my future. I moved back to the kitchen island, opened my laptop, and resumed my work. Over the next week, the silence from my family was absolute. There were no aggressive phone calls, no manipulative text messages from Spencer, and no unannounced visits. I knew them well enough to understand that this quiet was not a surrender. It was a tactical retreat. Richard and Carolyn never lost gracefully. They regrouped. I assumed they were desperately searching for another bridge loan, burning through their social capital to find a lender reckless enough to back Spencer without a pristine guarantor. I focused on my consulting firm, burying myself in the comforting logic of spreadsheets, tax codes, and audit trails. The work provided a welcome distraction from the lingering grief of losing Grandpa Harrison. The first warning sign arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 8 days after my parents stormed out of my apartment. I was reviewing an inventory audit for a mid-sized manufacturing client named David Thorne. David had been one of my very first clients when I started my firm. He was notoriously strict about his books, and we had built a solid, trusting professional relationship over the past 4 years. I received a brief, vaguely worded email from his administrative assistant. It stated that Thorne Manufacturing was immediately terminating my consulting retainer due to unforeseen internal restructuring. The termination clause in our contract allowed for this, but the suddenness of the decision made absolutely no sense. We were in the middle of a massive quarterly reconciliation. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed David's direct office line. It went straight to voicemail. I tried his cell phone, and after 4 rings, it was diverted to a generic automated greeting. I set my phone down, a prickle of unease forming at the base of my neck. Losing just one client was an unfortunate reality of running an independent business. It happens to everyone. But losing David Thorne in the middle of an active audit without a single phone call felt completely wrong. 2 hours later, the unease blossomed into outright alarm. A second email arrived, this one from a boutique marketing agency I had managed for 2 years. The wording was almost identical. They were pausing all external consulting contracts effective immediately. By Thursday afternoon, the trickle of cancellations had become an undeniable flood. 4 of my primary clients had severed ties with my firm. 2 more had suspended my access to their corporate financial portals pending supposed security reviews. My projected monthly revenue had just been completely decimated in the span of 72 hours. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a highly coordinated, targeted attack on my livelihood. I sat at my glass dining table staring at the growing list of termination emails on my laptop screen. Panic clawed at my chest, an old, familiar terror from the days when I relied on my parents for a roof over my head. I forced myself to breathe, reminding myself of the $15 million blind trust sitting safely out of their reach. I was not destitute. I was not in danger. But my parents did not know that. To them, my consulting firm was my only source of income, my only lifeline. They were systematically cutting off my oxygen. I needed proof. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marcus Vance. Marcus owned a regional chain of high-end sporting goods stores. He was also an avid golfer and a prominent member of the Oakbrook Country Club, the exact same exclusive social circle my father frequented. I dialed his number, bracing myself for another evasion. To my surprise, Marcus answered on the second ring. His voice sounded strained, lacking its usual jovial warmth. "Julia," he said, his tone thick with uncomfortable hesitation. "I am glad you called, actually. I was going to reach out to you later today." I gripped the edge of the glass table. "Marcus, please do not tell me you are terminating my contract too. I need to know what is happening. Half of my client roster has vanished in 3 days. Someone is orchestrating this." A heavy sigh echoed through the phone speaker. "It is your father," Julia Marcus said softly. "Richard cornered me at the clubhouse yesterday after a round of golf. He pulled me aside and told me he was speaking to me out of profound, painful parental concern. He said that since your grandfather passed away, you have been spiraling. He used the words severe mental breakdown. He claimed you were completely unmoored, erratic, and professionally compromised. My blood turned to absolute ice. My father was weaponizing my grief over the only person who had ever loved me. He told me you were making catastrophic errors in your personal life, and that he felt ethically obligated to warn your clients before those errors spilled over into our corporate accounts." Marcus continued, his voice laced with genuine pity. "He said your family was trying to get you into a residential psychiatric facility, but that you were refusing treatment. He strongly advised me to secure my financial data immediately." I closed my eyes, a wave of pure nausea rolling through my stomach. The sheer cruelty of the tactic was breathtaking. Richard was leveraging his decades of built-up authority as a prominent wealth manager. When a man in his position quietly warned a business owner about a compromised accountant, people listened. They panicked, and severed ties exactly as he intended. He was assassinating my character and destroying the business I had painstakingly built from nothing. I thanked Marcus for his honesty, assuring him I was perfectly healthy, and ended the call. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was the center of a siege. I understood the strategy with crystal clarity. My father was orchestrating a financial famine. He wanted to drain my bank accounts, destroy my professional reputation, and back me into a corner of pure, unadulterated desperation. He fully expected that within a month, I would be entirely out of money, facing eviction from my new apartment, and begging him for help. And the exact price for that help would be my signature on Spencer's predatory $500,000 bridge loan. They wanted to ruin me so they could absolutely control me. I sat back on the beige sofa staring blindly at the city skyline. They had crossed the final unforgivable line. They had tried to destroy me. I stood up, walked into my home office and retrieved my purse. I unzipped the hidden compartment and reached inside. My fingers brushed against the heavy matte paper. I pulled out the black envelope, the thick red wax seal gleaming in the afternoon light. Grandpa Harrison had known. He had predicted this exact moment. The time had come. The matte paper felt rough against my skin, a stark contrast to the smooth, cool wax of the seal. I carried the envelope back into the living room and placed it in the center of the glass dining table. It sat there like an unexploded bomb, radiating a quiet, destructive energy. I did not open it immediately. I simply stared at it while the reality of the last 3 days crashed over me in a suffocating wave. 2 of my largest consulting contracts were officially gone. The emails confirming their termination had arrived back-to-back earlier that morning, citing the exact same fabricated concerns about my professional stability that Richard had planted with Marcus. Those 2 clients alone represented nearly 40% of my annual operating revenue. My father had not just wounded my business, he had effectively gutted it. He had taken the one thing I had built entirely on my own, the one thing that gave me independence from his control, and he had crushed it under his heel without a single ounce of hesitation. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly calculating, that it left me breathless. They were completely willing to decimate my livelihood, to ruin my reputation in the Chicago financial sector, just to shield Spencer from the consequences of his own chronic incompetence. I sank onto the beige sofa, feeling a cold, hollow ache settling deep inside my chest. I reached for my phone, intending to silence the notifications that were still trickling in from concerned colleagues, but my thumb inadvertently brushed the screen, opening a social media application. At the very top of my feed was a fresh post from Carolyn. It was a professionally taken photograph of Spencer standing in front of his logistics company headquarters, looking tanned, confident, and completely unbothered. He was wearing a tailored navy suit, flashing that signature golden boy smile that our parents absolutely worshipped. Beneath the photograph, my mother had written a glowing tribute. "So incredibly proud of my son today," the caption read, followed by a series of heart emojis. Spencer continues to demonstrate unparalleled resilience in the face of adversity. True leaders are forged in challenging times, and he is steering his company toward a brilliant future. Family is everything, and we will always stand behind our visionary. I stared at the screen, the glowing words burning themselves into my retinas. Resilience in the face of adversity. The sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of the statement made my stomach turn. Spencer was not facing adversity. He had created a catastrophic financial disaster through reckless spending and terrible management. And now his visionary leadership was being subsidized by my destruction. My mother was publicly praising his strength while she and my father were privately assassinating my character to bail him out. They were parading his fake success while actively working to starve me out financially, hoping I would crawl back to them and surrender my spotless credit to fix his mess. The hollow ache in my chest vanished, replaced by a sudden intense heat. The lingering sadness over my family's betrayal burned away entirely, leaving behind a cold, hardened resolve. I tossed my phone onto the sofa cushion, The glowing screen dimmed, swallowing my mother's hypocritical words into darkness. I stood up and walked back over to the dining table. I stared down at the black envelope. I had spent my entire life playing by their rules, trying to earn a fraction of the respect they showered unconditionally on Spencer. I had accepted the meager scraps of affection they offered. I had tolerated their dismissive comments about my career. I had quietly moved into the annex to care for my grandfather when they refused to be inconvenienced by his failing health. And my reward for a lifetime of quiet loyalty was a coordinated professional hit orchestrated by my own father. I reached out and picked up the envelope. My hands were no longer shaking. My breathing was slow and measured. I slid my thumb under the flap, pressing directly against the center of the deep red wax seal. The thick wax snapped with a sharp, satisfying crack. I peeled the flap back, reached inside the heavy paper and extracted a small stack of documents secured with a brass paperclip. The pages were covered in Grandpa Harrison's unmistakable, precise handwriting, accompanied by several certified bank statements and legal addendums. I spread the documents out across the glass table, leaning over to read the first page. It was a detailed chronological ledger. Grandpa Harrison had not just left me a fortune. He had left me a meticulously documented map of my father's financial skeletons. The ledger detailed a series of unauthorized internal loans Richard had quietly siphoned from my grandfather's original corporate accounts over a period of 7 years. Every single one of those illicit transfers had been funneled directly into Spencer's various failing business ventures to keep them afloat. My eyes scanned the columns of numbers tracing the flow of stolen capital. Richard had utilized his position as my grandfather's wealth manager to bleed the estate dry before the trust was ever officially formed. He had masked the transfers as operational expenses and high-risk investments, hiding the paper trail behind layers of corporate jargon. But Grandpa Harrison, sharp and observant until his final days, had caught the discrepancies. He had quietly tracked every stolen dime. The second document in the stack was a binding promissory note drafted by Mr. Kensington and signed by my grandfather, officially transferring the debt of those illicit loans directly to me. The total amount Richard and Spencer owed the estate was staggering. It was not just $500,000. It was nearly $3 million. And because the debt was legally transferred to me as the primary beneficiary of the trust, I now held the exclusive right to call in those loans at any time. I read through the final page, a handwritten letter from my grandfather serving as a strategic directive. He outlined exactly how Richard would attempt to hide the missing funds during the impending probate audits. He predicted the exact corporate accounts my father would try to manipulate. He gave me the specific account numbers, the routing codes, and the names of the banking executives who had quietly facilitated Richard's transfers. The information was a loaded weapon precisely engineered to bypass all of my father's defenses. If I submitted these documents to the state regulatory board, Richard would not just lose his prestigious country club membership. He would lose his financial licenses entirely. He would face severe criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. His firm would be completely dismantled. I gathered the documents, smoothing the edges of the thick paper. The transition was absolute. I was no longer the discarded daughter trying to survive an unprovoked attack. I was the architect of their impending ruin. They had wanted a war over a $500,000 bridge loan. They had attempted to shatter my livelihood to secure their golden child's future. But they had tragically miscalculated the arsenal I possessed. I picked up my phone, scrolled past my mother's cloying social media post, and pulled up Mr. Kensington's direct contact number. I did not need to cry, and I did not need to negotiate. I needed to execute the strike Grandpa Harrison had prepared for me. I pressed the call button, listening to the steady rhythmic ringing, completely ready to tear their entire empire down to the foundation. Mr. Kensington answered on the third ring. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the adrenaline pounding in my ears. "Julia," he said smoothly, "I assume from the timing of this call that Richard has made his move. He contacted my clients. I replied. My eyes locked on the document spread across the glass dining table. He fabricated a story about a severe mental breakdown to trigger panic. I have already lost 2 major consulting contracts, and several others have suspended my access. It is exactly what you warned me about. He is trying to starve me out financially to force me to sign the bridge loan for Spencer. A predictable and ruthless tactic. Mr. Kensington noted the sound of a chair squeaking echoing through the receiver. And I presume you have broken the wax seal. I have. I confirmed, tracing the edge of the promissory note transferring $3 million of Spencer's debt to me. I am looking at the unauthorized internal loans Richard siphoned from the corporate accounts over the past 7 years. I have the account numbers, the routing codes, and Grandpa Harrison's letter. That is the immediate leverage, the attorney said, his tone shifting into something far more serious and hushed. But your grandfather was a man who believed in absolute transparency when the time was right. That initial stack of papers only explains the present. To truly understand who you are dealing with, you need to look at the past. Dig deeper into the envelope, Julia. Look at the foundational documents. I frowned, pulling the phone away from my ear and switching it to speaker. I set the device down on the table and reached back into the thick, matte black envelope. My fingers brushed against something else wedged tightly at the very bottom. I tipped the envelope upside down and shook it. A second, entirely separate bundle of paperwork slid out, landing with a soft slap against the glass. This stack was much older. It was bound together by a thick, brittle rubber band that snapped and crumbled into dry pieces the second I touched it. The pages were yellowing at the edges, carrying the distinct musty scent of documents that had been locked away in a dark safe for decades. I carefully separated the fragile pages, laying them out side by side, next to the recent ledgers regarding Spencer's failed ventures. The contrast between the crisp modern paper and the yellowed degrading parchment was jarring. Yet the underlying methodology connecting the two eras was identical. My father was a creature of absolute habit. He had utilized the exact same financial camouflage to shield his theft 25 years ago that he was currently using to hide my brother's massive corporate debt. My breath caught in my throat. These were not modern corporate printouts. They were decades-old bank ledgers, some printed on continuous dot matrix paper, with the perforated edges still attached, and others written entirely in faded black ink. Alongside the ledgers were several thick legal affidavits, each bearing the raised, embossed stamps of public notaries from over 2 decades ago. I leaned over the glass table, my trained forensic accountant eyes instinctively tracking the columns of faded numbers. I started with the earliest ledger, dated 25 years ago. This was the exact era when Grandpa Harrison's original regional logistics company was supposedly struggling against national competitors. It was the same year Richard and Carolyn miraculously managed to launch their now prestigious wealth management firm. The family lore, repeated at every country club dinner and holiday gathering, was that my parents had built their empire from the ground up through relentless hard work, savvy market investments, and sheer brilliance. The numbers on the yellowing pages told a starkly different, horrifying story. I followed the money trail, my finger tracing the physical manifestation of an ultimate betrayal. My parents had not earned their seed capital. They had stolen it. The ledgers detailed a highly sophisticated, systematic embezzlement scheme. Richard had not just mismanaged Harrison's logistics company. He had actively, intentionally bled it dry. I stared at transfer logs showing massive diversions of vendor payments, artificially inflated operational costs, and phantom consulting fees paid out to shell corporations that my father controlled. They had siphoned the very lifeblood out of my grandfather's business, draining the foundational capital month after month until the supply chains collapsed and the logistics firm was suffocating under a mountain of fabricated debt. "Do you see it?" Mr. Kensington's voice filtered quietly through the speakerphone. "He bankrupted him," I whispered, the sickening realization making my hands shake all over again. Richard intentionally bankrupted his own wife's father to help fund his wealth management firm. "Keep reading," the attorney instructed gently. "Read the affidavits. It was signed by Thomas Vance, a former business partner who had served as the logistics company's chief financial officer exactly 2 decades ago. In clear, legally binding language, the affidavit detailed how Richard and Carolyn had orchestrated the financial ruin of the firm. When Thomas and my grandfather finally discovered the massive discrepancies, it was already too late. The capital was gone safely washed and integrated into the pristine new accounts of Richard's nascent wealth management enterprise. The second affidavit was from Grandpa Harrison himself, written and notarized shortly after the original company collapsed. The pages were covered in his tight, familiar script, the ink pressed so deeply into the paper that I could feel the physical indentations of his pen. It explained the agonizing, impossible choice he had been deliberately forced to make. The depth of his despair bled through every single word. He had been a proud, independent man who had spent his entire life building an honest business, only to be gutted by Richard, his own trusted family. Richard had essentially backed him into a corner. If Harrison went to the authorities and reported the embezzlement, it would trigger a massive, highly public family scandal. It would ruin his daughter Carolyn, who was legally listed as a primary founder of the shell companies that had stolen the money. It would send the father of his young grandchildren to federal prison. To protect his daughter and avoid completely destroying the family name, Grandpa Harrison had agreed to a devastating compromise. He absorbed the blame for the logistics company failing. He took the public humiliation of bankruptcy and stepped down into an early forced retirement. Richard and Carolyn took the stolen millions, launched their prestigious wealth management firm, and spent the next 2 decades parading around Chicago high society as highly successful financial geniuses. They ruined his life, I said, a singular hot tear sliding down my cheek and splashing onto the glass table. They stole his legacy, destroyed his reputation, and then had the absolute audacity to treat him like a burden. They moved him into the annex and complained about the cost of his medical care while they were living in a mansion funded entirely by his stolen money. Your grandfather carried that painful secret for a very long time, Mr. Kensington said softly, but now you hold the undeniable proof of their original crimes. I looked down at the faded ledgers. The grief was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. I gathered the pages into a folder. I know exactly what to do, I said, my voice steady. I am going to dismantle their empire piece by piece until absolutely nothing remains. Mr. Kensington let the silence stretch for a moment after I said it. Then his voice came through the speaker again, quieter this time, but far more deliberate. He told me not to move too quickly, not yet. Grandpa Harrison, he explained, had anticipated my rage. Before I decided how to strike, I needed to read the second page of his handwritten letter. There was still one more layer to the plan. He told me that Harrison had anticipated my exact reaction, the rage and the absolute demand for retribution. I returned to the glass dining table and spread the remaining yellowed pages flat against the surface. My grandfather's handwriting shifted on the second page, the sharp, angry strokes softening into something profoundly weary. I read the words, hearing his raspy, gentle voice echoing in the quiet space of my apartment. He addressed me directly. He explained that when he first uncovered Richard's staggering embezzlement, his initial instinct was to call the authorities and press immediate federal charges. He had the irrefutable proof. He could have sent Richard to prison for 20 years and publicly humiliated Carolyn for her complicity. But then he looked at me. I was just a toddler at the time, barely walking, and Spencer was a newborn. Harrison wrote that he could not bear the thought of his grandchildren growing up visiting their father through reinforced glass in a federal penitentiary. He could not stomach the idea of our lives being permanently shadowed by the stigma of a massive, highly publicized corporate scandal. So he made the ultimate sacrifice. He swallowed his pride, accepted the blame for the logistics company going under, and allowed Richard and Carolyn to walk away clean with his stolen millions. He wrote that he did it entirely for me. He wanted me to have a normal childhood free from the crushing weight of their sins. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them away, my focus sharpening as I moved to the next paragraph. Grandpa Harrison made it explicitly clear that his silence did not equal forgiveness. He knew my parents lacked any genuine moral compass. He knew their arrogance would eventually outpace their stolen capital. While Richard and Carolyn were busy throwing lavish country club galas and expanding their wealth management firm, Harrison was quietly and methodically working in the background. The letter detailed how he slowly rebuilt his finances from absolute scratch. He lived modestly, pretending to rely on the meager allowance my parents grudgingly provided, all while investing every hidden dime he acquired into a sprawling network of anonymous shell companies. That was the true origin of the $15 million blind trust. It was not just a protective safety net for me. It was a fully weaponized shadow empire. Mr. Kensington remained on the line, listening to my breathing over the speakerphone as I digested the information. He prompted me to look at the final stack of legally bound documents secured at the bottom of the black envelope. I pulled them out, my forensic accountant training kicking into high gear. These were not ledgers of theft. These were corporate debt assignments. They were heavily redacted, deeply buried financial instruments, tracing back to my parents' prestigious wealth management firm. I stared at the pages in absolute shock. Richard and Carolyn had always projected an image of invincible, debt-free wealth. But the reality was drastically different. Over the past 15 years, as they desperately tried to maintain their lavish lifestyle and cover Spencer's endless string of failed investments, they had quietly leveraged their own firm. They had taken out massive, high-interest corporate loans through anonymous private equity channels, assuming their status made them immune to the consequences. They did not realize who owned the private equity firms purchasing their debt. Grandpa Harrison had utilized his blind trust and his labyrinth of shell companies to systematically buy up every single note of debt my parents issued. He had slowly, invisibly become their primary creditor. I traced the routing numbers and corporate identifiers, matching them perfectly to the assets listed in my trust portfolio. The $15 million was not sitting idle in a bank vault. It was actively holding my parents' entire financial existence hostage. Harrison had purchased the mortgage on their suburban mansion. He held the primary liens against the wealth management firm. Every time Richard and Carolyn thought they were cleverly securing a private anonymous bailout to cover their tracks, they were actually signing their souls over to the man they had bankrupted 25 years earlier. I sat back on my beige sofa, my mind spinning with the sheer brilliance of his strategy. My parents were completely oblivious to the trap closing around them. They thought they were the predators ruthlessly hunting me down and sabotaging my consulting contracts to force me into submission. They believed they held all the power because they had isolated me. But in reality, they were simply thrashing around inside a cage that my grandfather had built around them decades ago. Every single threatening move they made against me only tightened the locks. The debt instruments laid out before me were not just standard commercial loans. They were structured with aggressive acceleration clauses. Because they were high-risk anonymous loans, the controlling entity possessed the legal right to call in the entire balance at virtually any time, demanding immediate payment in full. If the borrower failed to produce the capital, the entity could seize the collateral. The collateral listed on these specific pages included my parents' personal residence, their investment portfolios, and the controlling shares of their wealth management firm. Mr. Kensington cleared his throat, bringing my attention back to the present moment. "Julia," he said, his voice lowering into a grave register, "your grandfather left these specific instructions for a reason. He knew that Richard and Carolyn would eventually try to destroy you. He bought their debt so you would never have to be a victim again. He wanted you to have the ultimate power to defend yourself. You hold the keys to their complete financial destruction. You own the debt." I looked at the documents, the ink suddenly looking incredibly powerful. I did own the debt. I owned the mansion where I had been treated like a secondary citizen my entire life. I owned the firm that Richard was currently using to destroy my professional reputation. They had called my clients today to starve me out. They had tried to break my spirit, so I would blindly sign over my credit to save Spencer from his own ruin. They had demanded $500,000, oblivious to the fact that they owed me millions more. What are the exact terms for default? I asked, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth or hesitation. How quickly can I call in the notes? Mr. Kensington did not miss a single beat. The acceleration clauses are incredibly aggressive, Julia. Once the demand is served, Richard and Carolyn will have exactly 48 hours to produce the full balance. Mr. Kensington's explanation hung in the silence of my apartment, cold and final. 48 hours. If I executed the demand, Richard and Carolyn would have exactly 2 days to produce $3 million, a sum I now knew they did not have. And when they failed, I would possess the legal authority to seize everything. Their sprawling suburban estate, their carefully curated investment portfolios, the controlling shares of their prestigious wealth management firm, everything they valued, everything they used to project superiority and power, would belong to me. I traced the embossed seal on the promissory note with my index finger, feeling the raised edges of the brass stamp. My grandfather had not just left me a safety net, he had left me a loaded gun pointed directly at the foundation of my parents' empire. They believe they are orchestrating my downfall, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet echoing clearly in the quiet room. They called my clients today. They fabricated a story about a mental breakdown to terminate my contracts. They thought starving me out financially would force me to sign that bridge loan for Spencer. It is a classic tactic, Mr. Kensington replied, his tone remaining perfectly neutral. Isolate the target. Apply maximum financial pressure. Force a surrender. But they are fighting a war that was lost decades ago, I said. A dark, unfamiliar satisfaction curling in my stomach. They are trying to bankrupt the person who currently holds the mortgage to their entire existence. Precisely, Mr. Kensington agreed. Your grandfather understood that true power is not merely holding wealth. It is holding the very mechanism that sustains your opponent's illusion of wealth. He built this structure meticulously, Julia. He ensured that when the time came, you would not need to negotiate. You would simply dictate the terms. I looked at the scattered documents, the yellowed pages, detailing a 25-year-old betrayal, lying side by side with the crisp, modern ledgers of Spencer's recent failures. The pattern was undeniable. My father had built a career on siphoning capital first from his father-in-law, and now attempting to do the same to me. The sheer arrogance of it, the absolute certainty that he would never face consequences, was staggering. What is the process for executing the demand? I asked, my forensic accountant training seamlessly taking over. I needed the practical steps, the legal mechanics required to initiate the collapse. It requires a formal declaration. Mr. Kensington explained, the sound of paper rustling, indicating he was referencing a specific file. We must draft a notice of acceleration and demand for payment. This document legally invokes the aggressive clauses embedded within the anonymous high-interest loans your grandfather purchased. It must be delivered via certified courier to their corporate headquarters and their primary residence. And the timeline begins immediately upon delivery. The clock starts the moment a representative of their firm, or Richard himself, signs for the package, the attorney confirmed. 48 hours, not a minute more. Given the scale of the debt and their current liquidity issues, which we both know are severe due to Spencer's logistics disaster, they will not be able to secure alternative financing within that window. Traditional banking institutions require weeks of due diligence for a loan of that magnitude. They will panic, I stated, picturing my father's face when he realized his anonymous private equity creditor was suddenly calling in the notes. They will scramble to find out who holds the debt. The trust is structured to maintain absolute anonymity right up until the moment of execution, Mr. Kensington assured me. The demand notice will be issued under the name of the holding company your grandfather established. They will not know it is you. Not initially. I considered this. The anonymity offered a distinct tactical advantage. It would allow the panic to set in pure and undiluted before the final devastating revelation of my involvement. Draft the notice, I instructed, my voice unwavering. I want it ready for delivery first thing tomorrow morning. Understood, Mr. Kensington replied, his tone shifting to a brisker, more operational cadence. I will have the documents prepared and reviewed by our litigation team tonight. However, Julia, before we initiate this action, I must ask if you are fully prepared for the fallout. This is the financial equivalent of a nuclear strike. There will be no salvaging your relationship with your parents or your brother after this. I let out a short, humorless laugh. My father deliberately sabotaged my career today, Mr. Kensington. He called my clients and fed them vicious lies to destroy my livelihood. My mother publicly praised Spencer while privately participating in my financial assassination. The relationship was severed the moment they decided I was nothing more than an expendable asset to be liquidated for Spencer's benefit. Very well, he said, accepting my resolve without further question. I will proceed with drafting the notice of acceleration. I will contact you early tomorrow morning to confirm the delivery schedule. Thank you, Mr. Kensington, I said, and disconnected the call. I sat alone in the living room, the silence pressing in around me. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the glass dining table, illuminating the scattered evidence of a quarter-century of deception. I carefully gathered the documents, organizing them chronologically, the yellowed ledgers forming the base, the recent financial audits stacked neatly on top. I slipped the entire bundle back into the heavy black envelope, the destroyed wax seal, a stark reminder that the truth could never be contained again. I walked over to the small antique writing desk, tucked into the corner of the room, unlocking the bottom drawer and placing the envelope securely inside. As I turned the key, a profound sense of calm settled over me. The anxiety that had plagued me for days, the crushing weight of my family's betrayal, had completely vanished. I was no longer on the defensive. I was no longer the scapegoat scrambling to survive. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I leaned against the marble counter, staring out the window at the fading Chicago skyline. Tomorrow the first domino would fall. The certified courier would deliver the demand notice, and Richard's carefully constructed world would begin to crack. I imagined him sitting in his opulent corner office, opening the envelope and realizing that his anonymous creditor was suddenly demanding $3 million he did not possess. I imagined the frantic phone calls, the desperate attempts to secure emergency funding, the dawning horror that his empire was built on a foundation of shifting sand. My phone vibrated on the counter, interrupting my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. It was a text message from Carolyn. "We need to discuss your professional situation, Julia. Your father mentioned you might be experiencing some difficulties with your clients. We are here to help, but you must be reasonable about the bridge loan. Call us." The sheer audacity of the message was breathtaking. She was attempting to play the role of a concerned mother, offering a lifeline. She and Richard had deliberately severed, all contingent on my surrender. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I was desperate. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over the keypad. I did not respond. Silence was the most effective weapon right now. Let them believe their strategy was working. Let them bask in their false sense of victory for one more night. I set the phone down and walked toward the bedroom, my mind already shifting to the logistics of tomorrow. I needed to be entirely prepared for the moment the 48-hour window expired. I needed to anticipate their moves, their excuses, their inevitable attempts at manipulation. I would not allow a single crack in my resolve. The executioner's axe was raised, and I would not hesitate when the time came to let it fall. The days that followed moved with a surreal, quiet urgency. While I finalized the legal mechanics of the demand notice with Mr. Kensington, ensuring every aggressive clause was primed for execution, my family was busy constructing their final magnificent illusion. Spencer, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hovering over his neck, had apparently found a miraculous life raft for his drowning logistics company. The details flooded my professional network before my mother even had the chance to boast about it. Spencer had managed to arrange a massive, highly publicized merger with Apex Solutions, a prominent rival tech conglomerate looking to absorb his failing infrastructure. It was a desperate bailout disguised as a strategic corporate victory. Apex was likely acquiring his firm for pennies on the dollar just to strip it for parts. But Richard and Carolyn were spinning the acquisition as the ultimate triumph of Spencer's visionary leadership. To solidify this false narrative and cement their status among the city's financial elite, my parents pulled every string and called in every favor they had to host a lavish celebration. They booked the grand ballroom at the Astoria, the most premier downtown hotel in Chicago, to formally announce the merger. The invitation arrived at my apartment via a private courier just 3 days before the event. It was printed on heavy embossed cardstock with gold foil lettering. I held the invitation in my hands, marveling at the sheer audacity of my mother. She had included a handwritten note tucked inside the envelope. It read, "That family must always stand united during moments of great success, and that she expected me to be there to support my brother." She even added a passive-aggressive postscript suggesting that attending a high society gala might help me network and secure some new clients to replace the ones I had recently lost. She wanted me there to witness Spencer's coronation. She wanted to parade her golden child's manufactured victory in front of me, rubbing my face in his supposed brilliance, while I stood in the shadow of my ruined consulting business. I placed the invitation next to the black envelope in my desk drawer. I would absolutely attend. I would not miss this night for anything in the world. The evening of the gala arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the Chicago air. I chose a structured emerald green evening gown that felt more like armor than silk. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style, applied my makeup with practiced precision, and slipped on a pair of modest diamond earrings that I had purchased myself after landing my very first corporate client. I did not look like a defeated woman crawling back to her family for financial scraps. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who owned the ground they were standing on. I stepped out of my rideshare and walked through the gilded revolving doors of the Astoria. The lobby was a symphony of polished marble, cascading crystal chandeliers, and the muted hum of wealthy patrons. I made my way toward the grand ballroom, following the signs for the Harrison Blackwell reception. The moment I crossed the threshold into the event space, the scale of my parents' delusion became glaringly apparent. They had spared absolutely no expense for this night. Towering arrangements of white orchids and hydrangeas centered dozens of tables draped in heavy silk. Waiters in crisp white jackets glided through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly from a raised platform in the corner. The room was packed with the most influential figures in the Chicago financial sector. I recognized banking executives, private equity managers, and several prominent local politicians. My father had invited everyone who mattered, ensuring maximum visibility for Spencer's supposed triumph. I navigated through the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, keeping to the periphery of the ballroom. I spotted my family holding court near the main stage. Richard was projecting absolute authority, his posture straight, a glass of bourbon in his hand, as he laughed loudly at a joke made by an Apex executive. Carolyn stood faithfully by his side, draped in a glittering silver gown, radiating the manufactured warmth of a perfect society hostess. She smiled and touched the arms of the guests, expertly guiding the conversation to highlight her son's achievements. And then there was Spencer. He stood at the absolute center of their orbit, practically glowing with unearned pride. He wore a custom tuxedo that fit him perfectly, accepting handshakes and backslaps with effortless charm. He looked like a man who had conquered the world, completely unaware that his entire existence was propped up by stolen money and anonymous debt. I stood near a towering ice sculpture, sipping a glass of sparkling water, simply watching the performance. The disconnect between the glittering reality they were projecting and the dark truth I held in my desk drawer was staggering. Every floral arrangement, every drop of imported champagne, every single brick of their pristine reputation was financed by the millions they had embezzled from my grandfather. They were celebrating a legacy built entirely on theft. My mother spotted me across the room. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second before she smoothed her features into a mask of maternal delight. She whispered something to Richard, patted Spencer on the arm, and began making her way toward me. The crowd parted around her as she glided gracefully across the ballroom floor. "Julia, darling," she said, projecting her voice just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, I am so relieved you decided to come. I was worried you might still be sulking about your little business troubles. I would not miss Spencer's big announcement, Mother, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even and my expression pleasant. It is quite a turnout you have managed to gather. Only the best for my son, she beamed, adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. The Apex merger is going to secure his future permanently. Your father and I are just so incredibly proud of his resilience. He faced down a temporary cash flow issue and engineered a brilliant corporate acquisition. That is what true business acumen looks like, Julia. Perhaps you should take notes. It might help you rebuild after your recent client losses. I am taking meticulous notes, I assured her, taking a slow sip of my water. I have learned a great deal about how this family operates over the past few days. Carolyn frowned slightly, sensing a shift in my tone, but unable to place it. She quickly recovered, offering a patronizing smile. Well, enjoy the champagne. Spencer is going to make his speech shortly. We expect you to stand near the front. Family unity is important tonight. She turned and walked back toward her golden child, leaving me alone in the crowd. I watched her rejoin Richard, the two of them whispering together as they glanced in my direction. They were confident they had broken me. They believed my presence here was an admission of defeat, a silent surrender to their authority. The string quartet suddenly stopped playing. A soft chime echoed through the ballroom as a technician tested the microphone on the main stage. The ambient chatter of the crowd began to lower, anticipation rippling through the room. Richard stepped up onto the stage, adjusting his jacket as he smiled down at the assembled guests. Thank you all for joining us tonight, he began, his voice booming with authority over the hushed crowd. We are here to celebrate a monumental milestone. My son Spencer has built a logistics empire through sheer brilliance and unwavering determination. He paused, allowing a polite ripple of applause to wash over the room. Tonight, we officially announce the impending merger between his company and Apex Solutions, a legendary partnership that will redefine the global supply chain. I stood near the towering ice sculpture, taking a slow sip of my sparkling water. The cold citrus stung my tongue, grounding me in the present moment. I did not feel a trace of the old anxiety that used to paralyze me during these family spectacles. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical focus. As Richard continued his glowing tribute, my mind retraced the exact steps I had taken over the past 48 hours. I had not reacted emotionally to the news of the gala or to Carolyn's patronizing text message. I had simply gone to work. The morning after the demand notice was drafted, I sat across from Mr. Kensington in his quiet office, surrounded by stacks of financial disclosures regarding the Apex merger. My forensic accounting background had taught me that corporate acquisitions of this scale were never about bailing out failing CEOs. They were about acquiring valuable assets. I needed to know exactly what asset Apex wanted so desperately that they were willing to overlook Spencer's catastrophic mismanagement. It took me 3 hours of digging through the heavily redacted term sheets and subsidiary filings to find the answer. Spencer's logistics company was hemorrhaging cash, bleeding capital through inefficient transport routes and bloated warehouse leases. However, buried deep within the company's research and development division was a proprietary routing algorithm. This specific piece of intellectual property was designed to optimize last-mile delivery networks, predicting supply chain disruptions before they occurred. That algorithm was the ultimate prize. Apex Solutions did not care about Spencer. They did not care about his empty warehouses or his deteriorating trucks. They were purchasing the entire failing company solely to acquire exclusive ownership of that singular piece of software. If the algorithm was removed from the equation, the entire merger would instantly collapse. I had looked across the desk at Mr. Kensington and asked a very specific question regarding the corporate debt assignments my grandfather had purchased. I needed to know what exact assets Spencer had pledged as collateral to secure those high-interest anonymous loans. Mr. Kensington had pulled the original promissory notes from the vault. We laid the pages flat on his desk, tracing the complex legal jargon detailing the terms of default. Because Spencer had been so arrogant and so desperate for quick cash to cover his initial losses, he had not protected his intellectual property. He had used the routing algorithm as the primary collateral for the largest of the loans. It was a fatal mistake. With the 48-hour window of the acceleration clause rapidly closing, I had not waited for my parents to attempt a negotiation. I instructed Mr. Kensington to execute a targeted seizure of the collateral. Utilizing the vast resources of the $15 million blind trust, we initiated a rapid anonymous legal maneuver. Through a newly formed shell company incorporated under my strict control, I officially foreclosed on that specific note of debt. I bypassed the physical assets leaving the useless warehouses and the depreciating transport fleet completely untouched. Instead, my shell company legally seized the proprietary routing algorithm. The transfer of ownership was executed flawlessly, logged into the corporate registry before the close of business. I had effectively become the silent majority stakeholder of the very deal my family was celebrating. The rival tech conglomerate thought they were negotiating with my brother, finalizing a contract that would be signed tomorrow morning. But Spencer no longer owned the technology he was selling. He was currently standing in a rented ballroom, wearing a custom tuxedo, preparing to announce a massive corporate acquisition based on intellectual property that now legally belonged to me. He was selling an empty box, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the deed to the contents securely inside my designer clutch. Richard finished his sweeping introduction, his voice rising in a crescendo of parental pride. He gestured expansively toward the center of the room. He called Spencer the future of logistics, a visionary who had proven that the family name would continue to dominate the financial landscape for generations to come. The grand ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers as the guests raised their glasses in a unified toast. Spencer stepped forward, buttoning his jacket with a practiced, confident motion. He walked up the small set of stairs and took his place behind the podium, shaking his father's hand before turning to face the adoring crowd. He looked incredibly smug. His smile was broad, his teeth gleaming under the bright spotlight. He waited for the applause to die down, soaking in the admiration of the city's elite. He began his speech with a self-deprecating joke about the late nights and early mornings required to build a tech empire from the ground up. He thanked his parents for their unwavering support, looking directly at Carolyn, who was practically vibrating with joy. He spoke about the challenges of the modern supply chain and how his innovative software was going to revolutionize the industry. He confidently stated that the partnership with Apex Solutions was not just a merger, but a flawless merging of visions. I watched him perform, analyzing his body language. There was no hesitation, no underlying doubt. He truly believed he had won. He believed he had outsmarted the market, secured his legacy, and proven once and for all that he was the superior sibling. He had spent his entire life failing upwards, shielded from consequences by my parents' wealth and influence. This lavish night was supposed to be his ultimate coronation. Spencer paused his speech, taking a dramatic sip of water before preparing to deliver his concluding remarks. The room was perfectly silent, hanging on his every word. He leaned into the microphone, his voice lowering into a serious, inspiring register. He spoke about the future, about pushing boundaries and exceeding expectations. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the investors and executives who were nodding in total agreement. His eyes briefly met mine. He offered a small, condescending smile, a silent acknowledgement of my presence at the periphery of his triumph. He thought I was standing there in awe, humbled by his staggering success. He thought he had won. He believed that by tomorrow morning the merger documents would be signed, the wire transfers would clear, and he would walk away with millions while our parents celebrated his genius. He had absolutely no idea that the moment Apex Solutions conducted their final routine audit of his assets, before signing the closing paperwork, they would discover the critical intellectual property had been seized by an anonymous creditor. They would immediately terminate the acquisition, leaving Spencer holding the bag for a ruined company and facing massive lawsuits for corporate misrepresentation. I did not return his smile. I simply maintained my calm, unreadable expression and slowly raised my crystal glass of sparkling water in a silent, mocking toast to his impending downfall. The end of his legacy was finally right here. The thunderous applause washed over the grand ballroom, signaling the end of my brother's triumphant address. Spencer stepped back from the podium, his face flushed with the exertion of his own ego. He waved to the crowd one final time before making his way down the carpeted stairs. A swarm of photographers pressed forward their camera flashes, creating a strobe effect that reflected off the crystal chandeliers. Angel investors and industry media representatives crowded around the base of the stage, eager to shake the hand of the man they believed was the new titan of logistics. I remained anchored to my spot near the towering ice sculpture, watching the spectacle unfold with clinical detachment. My father intercepted Spencer at the bottom of the stairs, gripping his shoulder in a display of fierce patriarchal pride. Carolyn was right behind him, wiping a single perfectly choreographed tear from her cheek. They were a portrait of absolute success, a wealthy dynasty basking in the glow of their latest conquest. I set my glass of sparkling water on a passing waiter's tray and smoothed the fabric of my emerald gown. I knew what was coming next. My mother had not invited me simply to be a spectator. She wanted me to serve as a prop, a contrasting background to highlight Spencer's brilliance. Within moments, the crowd began to part as my family moved away from the stage. They were not alone. Flanking Richard and Spencer were two older men in impeccably tailored charcoal suits. I recognized them immediately from the financial dossiers Mr. Kensington had provided. They were the senior acquisition executives from Apex Solutions, the very men who believed they were purchasing my proprietary routing algorithm tomorrow morning. Richard spotted me across the room. His chest puffed out slightly as he steered his entourage directly toward my corner. Carolyn glided beside him, her silver gown shimmering under the lights. Spencer walked between the two Apex executives, gesturing broadly as he explained some fabricated detail of his operational strategy. I held my ground, feeling the cool marble floor beneath my heels. My heart did not race. My palms did not sweat. I felt a profound, icy stillness settling into my bones. They approached with the swagger of conquering royalty, completely oblivious to the fact that they were walking straight into an invisible cage. "Julia," Richard announced, his voice booming over the ambient chatter. "I was wondering if you had slipped out early. It is quite a crowd tonight, isn't it?" He placed a heavy hand on Spencer's back. "Gentlemen, I would like to introduce my daughter Julia. Julia, this is Marcus Vance and David Sterling. They are partnering with your brother." I extended my hand, offering each man a firm handshake. "It is a pleasure to meet you both." Marcus Vance offered a polite smile. "The pleasure is ours, Julia. Spencer here is a rare talent." "Yes, well," Carolyn interrupted, stepping forward with a cloying smile. "We cannot all be visionaries like Spencer. Julia works in independent consulting. It is honest work, of course." The backhanded compliment hung in the air. "Which is exactly why she has been struggling lately," Richard added. "Julia has hit a bit of a rough patch with her client retention. We have been trying to advise her, but she has always been stubbornly independent." I looked at my father, absorbing the sheer venom of his words. He was the reason I had lost those clients. And now he was using the damage he had inflicted to humiliate me in front of the very executives he was trying to impress. "It has certainly been an educational week," I replied, my voice betraying no emotion. "I have learned exactly how cutthroat the market can be and how quickly fortunes can change hands when vulnerabilities are exposed." Spencer stepped forward, swirling his champagne. He looked me up and down. "You have to adapt, Jules," Spencer said. "You cannot just play it safe and expect to win. You have to take massive risks. You have to leverage everything to build something bigger. That is how you secure a legacy. That is how you attract partners like Apex." He turned to Marcus and David, seeking their approval. They nodded enthusiastically. Spencer turned his attention back to me, his smirk widening. "But listen, considering your recent setbacks, I want to help you out," Spencer continued. "Once the ink dries on the acquisition tomorrow morning, I am going to have a lot of influence over the new operational structure. I could probably carve out a mid-level advisory role for you, something stable, You would not have to worry about finding your own clients anymore. You could just focus on the clerical work. Carolyn clapped her hands together lightly. Oh, Spencer, that is incredibly generous of you. Do you hear that, Julia? Your brother is offering you a lifeline. You really should put your pride aside and accept his help. I looked at the four of them. My father radiating arrogant authority. My mother practically glowing with vicious satisfaction. My brother playing the benevolent savior while preparing to steal my dignity. And the two executives completely blind to the fact that they were negotiating with a fraud. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see me flinch. They were feeding on my supposed desperation. I did not give them a single drop of satisfaction. I simply smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that did not reach my eyes. I looked directly into Spencer's incredibly smug face, feeling the absolute certainty of the trap I had already sprung. That is an incredibly thoughtful offer, Spencer, I said smoothly. It is fascinating how quickly roles can reverse in the business world. You possess a unique perspective on asset management and intellectual property. I shifted my gaze to Marcus and David, offering them a knowing nod. I imagine tomorrow morning's final audit will be a highly revealing experience for everyone involved. The details of corporate ownership are always the most crucial part of any acquisition, wouldn't you agree? Marcus frowned slightly, a brief flicker of confusion crossing his features before he recovered his polite demeanor. Indeed, our legal team is exceptionally thorough. We leave nothing unturned. I am absolutely certain of that, I said, my smile widening just a fraction. I look forward to seeing the final results of your due diligence. Richard scowled, clearly displeased that I had not broken under their collective humiliation. He drained his bourbon and set the glass on a tray. Well, we have guests waiting to speak with the man of the hour, Richard finally said. We should mingle. Julia, try to enjoy the catering. And think very carefully about your brother's offer. It is the best deal you are going to get. I have already secured the best deal available, Dad. I simply said, my words completely lost in the swell of chatter. They turned away, moving back into the heart of the crowd like a conquering armada. Carolyn linked her arm through Spencer's, her laughter ringing out above the music. They were intoxicated by their own arrogance. They had no idea they had already stepped off the cliff. I remained in my spot. I watched them build their final monument to themselves. I absorbed every insult, every glance, and every compliment, filing them away. They had twisted my grandfather's entire legacy. But the illusion was over. I was the silent owner of their entire world, waiting for tomorrow morning. The orchestra played a soft, classical piece, washing over the hum of conversations, filling the grand ballroom. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays laden with champagne flutes. I stayed near the towering ice sculpture, watching my family bask in the artificial glow of their manufactured success. Carolyn laughed loudly at a joke that David Sterling made while Spencer shook hands with investors who looked at him like he was a genius. They were completely insulated by their wealth, unable to sense the ground giving way beneath their feet. The music faded, replaced by the sharp chime of a spoon tapping against crystal. The guests turned toward the main stage. Mitchell, my father's oldest business partner and the co-founder of their wealth management firm, stepped up to the podium. He adjusted his tie and smiled at the expectant faces. Ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell began, his voice echoing. Richard and I started our journey decades ago with nothing but empty pockets and a shared vision. We built our wealth with our own two hands, brick by brick, dealing with every obstacle the market threw at us. We created a family legacy built on hard work and uncompromising integrity. Tonight, looking at Spencer, I am overwhelmed with pride. We are passing the torch to a young man who possesses a brilliant mind. Spencer has constructed a logistics empire that has the entire industry watching in awe. He is the future of our legacy. The crowd murmured in agreement. Mitchell raised his glass high above his head, the crystal catching the light. I would like to open the floor, Mitchell announced, stepping aside. This is a night for family and for those who have supported Spencer. If anyone would like to offer a toast, please step forward. For a moment, the room was filled with polite encouragement. A few executives began moving toward the front, eager to align themselves with the man of the hour. But I was closer. I set my glass on a nearby table. My legs moved before my mind gave the command. The crowd parted naturally as I walked down the center aisle, my emerald gown sweeping against the carpet. As I got closer to the stage, the ambient noise died down. People recognized me. They knew I was the quiet sister who never spoke. I walked up the steps to the stage. Mitchell looked surprised, but stepped back, offering me the microphone. Down in the front row, my parents' expressions shifted. My father's brow furrowed in deep annoyance. Carolyn's smile froze into a strained line. Spencer crossed his arms over his chest, his smug expression unbothered, expecting me to offer a submissive tribute to his genius. I adjusted the microphone. The feedback whined for a fraction of a second before settling into dead silence. Every eye in the ballroom was locked on me. "Thank you, Mitchell, for that touching sentiment about family legacy," I said, my voice ringing out clear and steady. "I am Julia Spencer's sister. I would like to offer a few words." I looked down at Spencer. He offered a mocking nod. "However, I must decline the invitation to toast," I said. A collective intake of breath rippled through the front rows. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably behind me. My father took a sudden step forward, his face flushing dark red, but the sheer number of executives surrounding him kept him anchored. Mitchell spoke beautifully about how my father and he built this wealth with their own two hands. I continued, projecting my voice to reach the back of the ballroom. He spoke of integrity. Family legacies are rarely built on clean foundations. They are often built on secrets, on exclusions, and on the quiet destruction of anyone refusing to play their assigned role. The silence was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Carolyn grabbed my father's arm, her knuckles white. "Just 3 days ago, we buried my grandfather," I said, letting the weight of the loss anchor my words. "He was the true architect of the wealth this family enjoys. He funded the beginnings of my father's firm. And he was the only person in my family who valued me as a human being rather than an asset to be managed." The morning after we laid him to rest, while still wearing mourning clothes, my family presented me with a demand. They informed me that my grandfather's estate was being liquidated to cover Spencer's hidden debts. A sharp murmur broke out among the investors. Marcus Vance and David Sterling exchanged an alarmed look. Spencer's arms dropped to his sides, his smile vanishing. When I asked for time to grieve, I was told there was no time. I said, my voice hardening. I was handed a formal eviction notice. My parents forced me out of my childhood home, packing my belongings into garbage bags, all to prepare the property for a quick sale. They did this solely to generate emergency capital because Spencer's logistics empire was actually hemorrhaging millions. "Julia, stop this right now," my father hissed, his voice carrying up to the stage. He took another step forward, but a security guard at the edge of the stairs moved to block his path. "But an eviction was not enough," I continued. I locked eyes with Marcus Vance, ensuring the Apex executives heard every syllable. When I refused to co-sign a fraudulent bridge loan to mask Spencer's financial ruin, my family decided to apply pressure. They called my private consulting clients. They fabricated a malicious story about my mental stability and completely sabotaged my business. They destroyed my professional reputation in a calculated effort to bankrupt me, believing starving me out would force me into submission. The ballroom was paralyzed. The guests stared at my parents in horror. Carolyn covered her mouth with her hand, looking frantically around the room as her curated social standing disintegrated. Spencer looked pale, his chest heaving as the illusion of his success was systematically dismantled in front of the very people he needed to impress. They did all of this because they believed Spencer was the sole heir to my grandfather's actual fortune, I said, letting a cold smile touch my lips. They believed Spencer was a financial prodigy who just needed a little more capital to finalize this magnificent merger. But my grandfather was a very observant man. He saw exactly how this family operated. He saw the arrogance, the reckless spending, and the constant need to cover Spencer's failures, and he made preparations. I paused, letting the tension stretch until it was almost unbearable. I looked at Spencer, watching the dawning realization of pure terror wash over his face. My grandfather did not leave his fortune to Spencer. I announced my words cutting through the air like glass. He did not leave it to my father. He established a $15 million blind trust, a trust that holds the anonymous high-interest debt that Spencer so desperately took out to keep his failing company afloat. And my grandfather left that entire trust and every single note of debt it contained solely to me. The collective gasp from the audience was deafening. Whispers erupted like a sudden storm. Marcus Vance pulled out his phone, his face pale with sudden panic. Spencer is not a financial prodigy, I stated clearly, driving the final nail into the coffin. He is a man drowning in debt, and I am the creditor who owns it all. The silence following my declaration was so absolute, it felt as though the entire ballroom had been plunged into a vacuum. I looked down at Spencer. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes darting frantically between me, his parents, and the investors. He opened his mouth to deny it, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed by the sudden violent collapse of his reality. I gave him no real chance to recover. I turned my attention to the left, catching the eye of the audiovisual technician sitting in the raised control booth. Mr. Kensington had paid the man a considerable sum for his cooperation. I gave the technician a brief, sharp nod. The massive digital screens flanking the main stage suddenly flickered. The corporate branding vanished, replaced by stark, high-resolution scans of yellowed paper. It was the 25-year-old ledgers I had pulled from my grandfather's black envelope. The documents were magnified to a towering scale, the handwritten notes and typed transfer orders impossible to miss. I stepped closer to the microphone, ensuring my voice cut through the rising murmur in the crowd. What you are looking at on these screens is the true foundation of my parents' wealth, I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. These are the private, unredacted accounting ledgers from my grandfather's original firm. They detail a highly organized, systematic embezzlement scheme executed by Richard and Carolyn over the course of 7 years. They siphoned millions of dollars from my grandfather's accounts, laundering the capital through a series of shell companies to quietly fund the creation of their own wealth management firm. They did not build their empire with their own 2 hands. They built it with stolen money. Pandemonium erupted. The polite whispers of the city's elite transformed into an uproar of shouting gasps and frantic overlapping conversations. Camera flashes exploded as the industry media realized they were capturing the financial scandal of the decade. Dozens of phones were raised in the air, recording the screens, recording my parents, and recording me. Carolyn let out a shrill, piercing shriek. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the stage, her face twisted into a mask of pure panic. She screamed at the technician to turn the screens off, demanding that someone cut the power, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. Richard looked as though he had been physically struck. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin an unhealthy ashen gray. He stared up at the screens, his eyes locked on the undeniable proof of his decades-old crime, his signature clearly visible on the fraudulent transfer documents. He could not deny it. The evidence was absolute, and it was being photographed by every financial reporter in the tri-state area. I looked back down at the front row, focusing my attention entirely on Marcus Vance and David Sterling. The 2 senior executives from Apex Solutions were no longer looking at Spencer with admiration. They were looking at him with absolute disgust. Marcus Vance was gripping his smartphone so tightly his knuckles were white. He was a man who traded in risk assessment, and he had just realized he was standing in the middle of a massive liability crater. Marcus did not hesitate. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. He buttoned his suit jacket with sharp, angry movements, his face a portrait of cold corporate fury. He turned his back on the stage for a moment, signaling to David Sterling, who began gathering his briefcase and legal folders. Then Marcus turned back around, locking his furious gaze directly on Richard and Spencer. He did not use a microphone, but his voice was loud and commanding enough to cut through the noise. "This deal is officially terminated," Marcus announced, his words ringing like gunshots. "Apex Solutions is withdrawing all offers of acquisition effective immediately." Spencer seemed to snap out of his paralysis. He scrambled down the steps of the stage, his hands reaching out toward Marcus in pure desperation. "Marcus, wait, please," Spencer pleaded, his voice cracking devoid of his former arrogance. "We can explain this. Those documents on the screen, they have nothing to do with my company. That is old family business. It does not affect the merger. We still have the routing algorithm. We still have the technology you want." Marcus stopped walking. He looked at Spencer with a mixture of pity and revulsion, as if examining an insect. "You do not have anything, Spencer," Marcus said, his voice dripping with contempt. "We conducted our final asset verification audit an hour before we arrived. Our legal team discovered the emergency transfer of ownership filed this afternoon. We know that you pledged your proprietary routing algorithm as collateral for a private loan, and we know your anonymous creditor seized that collateral at the close of business today." Marcus pointed a sharp finger up at the stage directly at me. "Your sister just confirmed what our lawyers suspected. She holds the debt. She owns the algorithm. You tried to sell us a company that no longer possesses its only valuable asset. You committed gross misrepresentation and attempted to expose Apex Solutions to massive fraud liability. You will be hearing from our litigation department regarding the breach of our preliminary agreement. Do not ever contact my office again." Marcus and David turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd of stunned investors and making a rapid exit toward the main doors. Spencer stood completely frozen, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The reality of his absolute ruin finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his ego. His bailout had evaporated in a matter of seconds. He was left with a bankrupt company, millions in defaulted loans, and a looming corporate lawsuit. Richard, however, refused to accept defeat. The ashen gray of his face rapidly morphed into a deep mottled purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar as he shoved his way past a group of shocked angel investors. He stormed toward the steps of the stage, his fists clenched at his sides. The security guards immediately moved in, blocking his path and forcing him to a halt at the bottom of the stairs. "This is defamation," Richard screamed, his voice raw and ragged, spittle flying from his lips. "You are lying. You fabricated those documents. I will sue you for everything you have. I will bury you in litigation until you have nothing left. You are finished." Thus I watched him rage, feeling untouchable. I did not need to respond to his empty threats because the final piece of my grandfather's plan was already in motion. From the dark shadows near the ballroom exit, Mr. Kensington stepped out into